Welcome back to The Unnatural Selection, the podcast where we examine the science, the ethics, and the human consequences behind designer babies and modern genetic engineering. I'm your host, Ethan Sakara, and in today's episode, we go into the past, into the history that shapes every bioethical debate that we're having today. When we talk about altering human life, we're not starting from a blank slate. Long before CRISPR, long before gene editing, there were movements that believed they could improve humanity through control. Movements that fueled discrimination, state violence, and atrocities all throughout the globe. Understanding that history isn't optional for our discussion, it's essential. That's why I'm honored to welcome today's guest, Dr. Karl Krook-Crandall. He's a historian of Russia, the Holocaust memory, and modern Europe. Today he joins us to help connect the dark legacy of eugenics from its early pseudoscientific roots to the historic implementation under the Nazis to our current conversation about designer babies, genetic enhancement, and what happens when science races ahead of ethics. This is episode 2, Is Individual Choice Enough?
How did you get here? What brought you to history?
Did we all get here? No, I mean, I got into history, the right faculty member at the right time in my undergrad.
Okay.
So I'm technically a Russian historian.
Mm-hmm.
My research happens to deal with the Holocaust in Russia. And so, my path here was just like many others, the right professor at the right time, interested me enough, demonstrated how history could be taught in a way that was interesting. And I really like the research component of it. So, sometime later, without dating how old I am, I got my doctorate. And it was actually, I did not ever intend to go down this path of Holocaust education or Holocaust history. I was interested in Russian minority religions in Russia.
Okay.
Kind of where I wanted to go, and then kind of was invited to a seminar at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. that was looking at the Holocaust in the East and exclusively trying to get faculty and students interested in studying the Holocaust from a Soviet perspective because it's really under-researched. And so it piqued my interest. The next thing you know, sometime later, here I sit teaching all the uplifting courses in the Honors College about things like Holocaust studies and genocide.
Yeah.
And
did you jump around schools? Like, did you take like a gap chunk of time between your doctorate and stuff?
A little bit. So I graduated with my undergrad and then worked for about 2 or 3 years. I actually finished my undergrad up at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, got a job offer in a completely different industry. I was actually working in broadcast media.
Okay.
And got a job in Arkansas at the University of Arkansas, which gave me the opportunity to go back to school on basically for free. Paid a little bit of tuition money, but got my master's in history. And then from there, decided I really wanted to get to do the deal, to go to get my doctorate, and got an invite to come up to Washington State University, which is where I did my doctorate.
Okay.
So I've hopped around a bit, but I've also really embraced the idea of collegiality, just meeting people from all over the place. I have colleagues literally all over this point.
So talking about how designer babies work, how they're kind of tied to kind of this semi-new age of eugenics, how do you think that ideology changed throughout history?
So I think it's important to understand that eugenics comes out of the creation of the natural sciences, which are a product of the Enlightenment. So we're going back 300-400 years of human history when we stopped thinking about the world in terms of, without being overly religious, but like, a deity created things to trying to understand how the world actually is. And between 1400s and the 1600s, we start seeing the emergence of people who are called naturalists, who their task was to go out and literally define the world. So they started with things that were in front of them, plants and animals. And from that, we see the evolution of actual sciences, things like human anatomy. And that's where we start to see the potential and then what becomes the idea of eugenics. Okay. What I mean by that is if you go back and look at the earliest anatomy textbooks, they are deliberately created to differentiate the genders and to start to create systems of difference between the biology of the male and the female. And anatomy relies heavily on those early naturalists. So people like Carl Linnaeus, British naturalist. You go to the British Museum, his whole exhibit just to him, right? And so those early, practitioners of this new science they're calling anatomy are borrowing the terminology from Linnaeus, who's describing plants, applying them to corpses, male and female corpses, which they really don't understand. It's heavily gendered. They're not actually looking at many female corpses. They're looking at mostly male corpses and then making stuff up about women because they were afraid to look at women for some reason. Okay. From there, at the same time that anatomy is developing, we start to see Darwin and the ideas of Darwinism, right? The idea of evolution. And these two fields slowly start to mix into this concept of scientific racism. And from scientific racism is born this idea of eugenics. And I think it's important to understand that both the concept of scientific racism and eugenics are embracing the idea of giving a scientific appearance to ideas and concepts that are deliberately designed to different or to create difference between others, between genders, between this idea of race, right? This concept, which is a concept, it's a social construct. Race is not an actual thing, but they're using it with the deliberate purpose for larger systems of inequality to justify things like colonization, right? We should, as white Europeans, have this scientific evidence that demonstrates that we are superior to those places that we are colonizing and then putting people who look different from us under our thumb. And so eugenics and to the earlier extent scientific racism are used to enforce those systems in the 19th and 20th centuries.
In terms of the emerging idea of the pseudoscience, how did it change or was used more drastically by Nazi Germany compared to other places? Obviously, with like forced sterilization.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There are a lot of parallels between what emerges in Nazi Germany and what happens here in the U.S. And there's a lot of borrowing. I don't want to say from both sides. The Nazis definitely borrowed a lot from the U.S., especially in terms of justifying their actions by, pointing to the U.S. during a period of our segregation and embracing the ideas of eugenics as a form of social control and social development. What I think is also important to remember is that the eugenics of Nazi Germany did not begin in Nazi Germany. It actually began under the German Empire, which preceded, it was two governments removed, going all the way back into the German Empire. Right? German Empire is founded in 1871, and they decide they want to be colonial power. And one of the places they take over is a colony that they call German Southwest Africa. And there's a reason I'm telling you this, by the way. Okay. This is the connection piece. This is why this matters. Okay. So if you don't know anything about it, what we refer to as the first genocide of the 20th century happens in German Southwest Africa under the German Empire. Now, the Nazis are not a thing during this period. It's the people that matter, because as German Southwest Africa is engaging in this genocide, we actually see the early practitioners of German eugenics ideology and thinking working in that field. What I mean by literally working in German Southwest Africa. So you have people like Eugen Fischer and Ottmar von Verscher, who were experimenting on their prisoners, the prisoners of war in German Southwest Africa, the Herero and the Nama. These were the indigenous people who were trying to throw off the yoke of German imperialism. And in some cases, mostly men, were captured and put into concentration camps, places like Shark Island, where they were forced into labor systems, and others were experimented on. They would infect them with diseases to see what would happen, or they would give them a disease and then they would inject them with what they thought might be medicine to see if it would cure it. And in the worst cases, the whole study of skulls became a big thing, and they would take the heads of corpses and ship them back to Germany to be examined, used in eugenics experiments, to again justify this pseudoscience. And I hate using science even to describe eugenics, but That's what they're trying to use it as evidence. Those same people, right? Eugen Fischer, Otmar von Verscher, go on to become early members of the Nazi Party and go on to not only influence, but teach more notable eugenicists, people like Josef Mengele, right? The doctor of death from Auschwitz. So there's a connection here of a long-standing idea of the scientific principles being developed, but it predates the Nazis, but is then brought into Nazi ideology because of, again, the principal need to differentiate others. And in the case of the Nazis, trying to differentiate, this idea of an Aryan race from everyone else, specifically Jews, Slavs, etc.
Yeah, I was going to say the early Germany had the whole phrase, racial hygiene.
Mhm.
Predating Nazi Germany. The idea was definitely around, for sure.
Absolutely.
Do you think that there's a level, and I'm not trying to sympathize here, but do you think that there's a level of you're saying differentiate, do you think that that's happening as almost an excuse to mistreat people? Like to kind of see them as less than human?
I mean, they believe that. Like, that's the thing. Like, Nazi ideology genuinely believed, and again, part of it is that they embrace the idea of eugenics, that there is a biological difference between what they're defining as this Aryan person and others. Now, they are not the only people to believe this. There are studies that from all over the world, especially all over the European world, that do the same kinds of things. But the Nazis just embrace it all, and then they take it up a whole other level. And so there are some who genuinely believe in this pseudoscience. There are others who use it, again, as a means to justify their beliefs and their actions. And it's far more complicated than just like eugenics, but it really does feed a broader scale or a broader spectrum of Nazi ideology that includes things like justifying who their political enemies are and connecting them, again, in this case, mostly with Jews. So, they create the whole narrative about Judeo-Bolshevism, right? That they're communist, that all Jews are communists, which is nonsense, the way in which they're trying to spread it. But they use eugenics as a justification for their belief in their superiority.
Mhm.
Again, the reality is there's no difference between humans, but they're using that appearance of science to then justify the actions that they will take. And they do it in ways in their propaganda that, again, are very influential to get buy-in from the German populace, right? They always define, or they always talk about Jewish persons as vermin or insects that they spread, like mice. And they use that language, and again, their pseudoscience, to create that justification of the system of difference and then carry out their larger actions.
Moving into stuff that we can see kind of like happening now, do you necessarily see any parallels in the idea of like almost if you're given the ability to decide all the traits for your child, why would you decide to make them disabled? Why would you decide to make them, quote unquote, anything but white and male? Do you see any kind of parallels that would maybe like come out of this in terms of the same ideas that happened in Nazi Germany in terms of like eugenics and kind of this new individual's choice instead of like the populist control?
Right. There's always the potential. I think my first inclination is to say they're not the same, and that there's the two, like the major difference here is that what you're talking about with genetic editing is an actual science, right? Like there is like scientific evidence to what they're doing, whereas with the Nazis and others that are using eugenics are literally using it as a pseudoscience for the system of others and to mistreat people. Like here in the U.S., you already mentioned forced sterilizations, right? And if you actually go back and you look at who are they sterilizing, again, it's all about difference. In the U.S., and there are studies out there that will show you this, show great statistics. By and large, the number one persons who were going to be sterilized were incarcerated Black women. Like, there's a reason for that, and it's about a system of control. Okay. Now we're talking about genetic editing. To what end? If it's to prevent disease, to me, that seems like we're advancing. On the contrary, if it is to design a person that looks one specific way, that is something different. I've yet to see somebody tell me that that's what they're doing now. Granted, I'm not reading all the scientific journals. That's not what I do. I don't, in the moment, see them as the same things. But do we have the same ethical questions? Absolutely. And I think that it's more individualized in a way for now, until some big tech company comes in and says they're going to be the only purveyor of genetic editing, then we have something else to consider. For now, I think where the difference lies is really about economics, right? Who can actually afford to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's where the potential parallel exists. Okay. In that, who are the people that are actually using this, right? Is it going to be, as an example, right? Is it going to be a wealthy white family living in one location versus, a less fortunate or an economically depressed family of color who's not going to have access to perhaps cure their family of diabetes, right? And if it becomes about economics, then absolutely. Then we're starting to get into this ethical question of what is the purpose of this technology? Is it to better people or is it to better a certain sector of people? And that's, to me, is where the parallel exists right now.
Yeah. I would say there's this idea of almost like, I don't want to say super race, but, genetically edited people can be, if it's a appearances idea, not like a curing disease, but specifically, appearances, it could be something like you can, make your child smarter than everyone else or stronger than everyone else or grow taller than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, if you get to that level and it is only about money, who can afford this, do you see any potential problems with there being almost like a super race? I don't know how to actually say what it would be, you know what I mean?
Now we're getting into Star Trek.
Like a new species.
Right?
Yeah.
You're talking about we're going to make Khan, right?
Yeah.
From Star Trek. I don't.
Because then the idea is actually, not to say that, they were right with the Aryan race, they were totally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But now you would have, actual evidence to back up that this new subset of humans is, better in every way than everyone else. In terms of being smarter and stronger and those kind of things.
I think it also depends on how you qualify being better.
That's true too.
Right? Like, do we actually know that we're going to we would be able to make people more intelligent? I don't know. Physically stronger? Maybe. We've also done that with things like steroids over my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, is there really a difference there? I don't know. I think where this technology has so much of a benefit is really removing from the human genome all of these diseases that have kept us from progressing, right? Like in my lifetime, predating my lifetime, they've been talking about finding a cure for cancer. When is that going to happen, right? If we're worried about them designing the next human, maybe they need to get the priorities straightened around. Because odds are, if they're all about only perfecting humans or trying to make them stronger or smarter and not removing the things that have the diseases, right, that have continued to hold us back for generations, those same things are going to exist in these people. So, at some point, someone's got to make a decision of what's the actual aim.
Money runs the world. And in terms of the people who are funding these kinds of research projects are big medical companies trying to, make the next insulin kind of thing.
Right.
So, playing the cynical role, there's almost an idea of like, why would they want to make a cure to diabetes to cure, they're making enough money off of insulin.
Okay.
And is it the insurance companies that are gonna have to pay for this kind of CRISPR stuff to get rid of diabetes in your family? Or is the money in, I can go shopping for my kid? There's that idea as well.
The ideal world, Gene Roddenberry world, we would be doing this to better ourselves and not for profit.
Yeah. The people who advocate for genetic engineering, like we were just talking about, there's an idea of like positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Negative meaning, you know, taking things away like disease. Positive meaning like adding things like extra muscle mass or height. Was there any historical kind of ideas like this used back in the day in the past?
I really want to make sure that we differentiate between eugenics and gene editing. These are two completely different things, right? Eugenics was pitched as a way to use our scientific knowledge to breed out problems, right? Deviancies is the terminology that they would use. And so that could include things like mental impairment, but it also included things like social deviancy, theft, drunkenness, you know, deviancy, being a troubled person, depression, right? And the way in which they would read these characteristics out was more often than not just sterilizing people, but that doesn't actually solve those problems, right? Because again, eugenics was deliberately being used to differentiate others more, and again, more often than not, to suggest that persons who were white, mostly European, did not have these issues of, being a criminal or being a drunkard, right? And the people that were then being, sterilized or having eugenics treatments, whatever the heck you want to call them, are by and large persons of color who may or may not have actually done something. They might have just had depression. We're just going to use the issue. Let's just say alcoholism, right? Okay. We can use eugenics to breed out alcoholism. I call baloney. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't work that way, right? Because, okay, so maybe they sterilized a bunch of people that were, put in jail in the drunk tank because they kept coming back. That doesn't mean that alcoholism doesn't exist in the majority of the rest of the world, because it absolutely does.
Yeah.
The same thing could happen with all the traits that they were trying to say, we can breed out. It's a bunch of nonsense, right? That's ultimately what we have to remember is eugenics is nonsense.
Yeah.
It is trying to use the face of science to justify differentiating. That's it.
History and how they've used these ideas has always been, state level or controlled. I know we talked a little bit about it in terms of like the positives of like now it's individual choice. Do you see was individual choice really happening in the past? Like
with eugenics?
Yeah, in terms of like if you had a kid that, had a problem, did you kind of like dispose of it? Like was that ever happening? So in terms of the idea of like it being like the future of gene editing and stuff like that is all kind of individual choice in terms of like, you still have maybe a doctor's opinion, but it still kind of comes down to your own choice. Do you see maybe that kind of being like a falsehood of almost like it still is state controlled because, insurances have to pay for it or things of that nature? Like there are other factors that doesn't make it individual.
I can see it going that way. I think it's so new. And really, at this point, I would probably argue pretty much unattainable for the majority of the population.
Right? Yes.
Like, you have to have the money to do it. Even IVF. I can't, maybe.
Normally it's covered, I think, by insurance if you have specific genetic
right.
If you know that you carry some kind of gene.
So yeah, like IVF is even that is specialized where insurance is coming in, but a lot of people are paying for that out of pocket. 25, 30 grand just to try it once.
Yeah.
Where we're going with this question.
I was saying, is there like a idea of almost, because in the past most of this has been through state control, is there a state control, even though it feels like it's individual, is there state control because insurance may not cover something you want to choose, or because it's expensive, you can't get a hold of it, only a certain class can get a hold of it?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't know that I've got an answer. But like you do kind of put these like ideas and fears into my mind of how it could be used inappropriately. I think in the moment, until the actual cost of such technology and its use comes down, I don't think it's going to be an insurance issue, because insurance companies are not going to pay for something if they don't have to. They're not in the business of giving away money. When it does become more affordable, then we have something else to think about. Is it state controlled? I would say it's less state controlled unless laws are put into place that say you can or cannot use this. Right? We're currently in a world, in a post Roe v. Wade, where a court has now decided that states get a say in whether or not women have access to abortion.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's an area where we have state control over a person's body. And there are lawmakers, not trying to get too political, but this is to your question, right? There are now lawmakers at the state level who seek to introduce laws or pass laws that would punish women and families who seek that as a medical option. So who's to say that in the future they might try to do something with this kind of technology and creating laws? There's the potential.
Mhm.
And so the short of it is, in the moment, no, there's not some big brother, big state control. There's the possibility.
Mhm.
People make decisions today, right, whether or not to have families based upon their family's genetic background, right?
Do you think that this kind of future technology in the past, in terms of like Nazi Germany and getting rid of people they deemed unfit?
I mean, they were, but also you have to remember that like part of the whole mindset and ideology was educating people that these, in this case, I'm using the Jews, but there were many other groups, but like Jews were the deviant.
Yeah.
And there's an educational piece to that it's not just, well, if you get rid of them, we don't think about them, we know they're human. There also has to be a propaganda component that says you have to think this way.
That reinforces that. But also the idea of not really interacting with them does help to enforce that idea.
It would reinforce that they are different. Whether or not they were less than would depend upon a person's thinking and education.
Yeah.
In that way.
Okay. So in terms of the idea of like all of this work that's been put into like accessibility, does this technology maybe take away from accessibility that's been put in place with these kind of groups?
Not really, especially like in terms of the eugenics era, because nobody was really caring about whether or not a person was differently enabled or not. So you need a wheelchair, a ramp. Who cares? It's the 1930s.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, even in the US, like look at our history of trying to pass legislation to protect those kinds of things. Like, we didn't get the ADA until, like, we didn't know that the ADA was coming until the 1980s. That's 20 years after the Civil Rights Movement, right? The Civil Rights Movement doesn't say anything about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, to your question, I think the short answer is not really, because the ADA put in physical infrastructure that has been deemed not just that it's necessary, but it's so ingrained. How do you get rid of it? It's almost like saying, well, we have ebooks now, so we don't need physical books anymore.
Yeah, but the physical books are already all around.
Right? Like, look at my shelves, right? These books are not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Go to Klein Library. Those books are not going anywhere. So I think what you could see is less about creating accessibilities that are designed for structures that, and I'm using physical structures in this case, but like creating physical accessibilities into structures that were created without that in mind versus newer buildings that are just going to be accessible from the get-go, right? That we don't need to put stairs into things or whatever, or every building will have an elevator without even thinking. Why? And we take those things for granted, I think, now.
Yeah.
Right? Elevators aren't going to go away. Unless somebody invents a transporter. Could happen.
Yeah. So obviously we've talked a lot about, the actual science and the pseudoscience.
Correct.
Eugenics was tried to be backed by science. They used science in quotations as
the appearance of science.
Yeah. As a way, almost an authoritative role to
absolutely
demean other people. Do you see like how is science's role changed? Obviously there's a lot of trust that was probably lost. How do you feel like science as an authoritative role has changed?
I think part of it is that like they've gone back to, and maybe I'm being a little lofty in how I think about it, but kind of going back to the original, Enlightenment era of rational, reasonable thinking, right? that science is not, the intent of science should not be used for a political or ideological agenda and then corrupt it. And that we do experiments and we replicate experiments and we embrace this concept of peer review, right? Like, I can't just go out and publish my own musings and be assumed that just because I have a PhD that my research is good. If I'm going to publish and I want to do it the reputable way, I go through an academic process of a double-blind peer review to ensure that my work is just as sound. And so I think, and this is where it gets a little funky today. I think we as academics really do respect the sciences for what they do and how they operate. I also fear that there are individuals, leaders, who want to discredit science. To what end, I don't know. Who want to say to the face of thousands of scientists that I know better than you and your research. I'm going to believe what I found on a website. Right. And I think part of that discrediting that you're kind of getting at in the past with the eugenics movement is now being heaped upon academic study. Because, and to some extent, we did this to ourselves. We created a persona of academics as being on this ivory academic tower that no one can touch us and that we can't make mistakes, and we make mistakes all the time. But then by separating ourselves and in some ways making our research inaccessible to the layperson, it gives space to the conspiracy theories in the age of the internet and now the age of social media and AI to promote garbage, right? The return, if you will, of pseudoscience, where a person can lead, the FDA or whatever our governmental institutions are, that says, you know what, regardless of what thousands of scientists have said, we still believe that, that autism is caused by vaccines. Like, how is that helping the situation in any way? It's not, right?
Obviously, you talked about how like wealth probably plays a huge point in terms of this stuff. And we talked about, how maybe there could be a biologically enhanced upper class that has kind of contrast to, Nazi Germany agenda in terms of like, now there's an actual upper class that's better. Do you see that as maybe being a problem ever, or?
Interesting question. I think, well, I don't know. Like, I'm a historian. I can't predict the future.
Yeah, for sure.
There are definitely those types of inequalities that exist in our society and other societies around the world, right? And so could you draw the conclusion that those of means might have access to this new genetic technology that others won't have? Of course. Will it get there? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I can predict that, but we can look at examples of societies in which social stratification was used and those in a specific better class biologically fared better. Okay, let me give an example of that. I'm a Russianist, right? I'm a Russian historian. You ever seen a skinny picture of Leonid Brezhnev? Leonid Brezhnev was the 4th general secretary of the Soviet Union. So he ran the US. He was the second longest serving general secretary after Stalin. We'll leave Stalin out of this, right? But he's a prime example, right, of, a stratified quote unquote communist society where everyone was supposed to be equal, and yet you had an upper echelon of those who are running the Communist Party were being treated better. They had better access to food. They had access to cars. Like, they had better access to healthcare, right? You never see a skinny picture of Leonid Brezhnev. Why? Because that's what happens when that stratification can happen. So yeah, you've created a biologically stratified system because they have access to nutrition. So yes, the potential is there. I think the question will also become who's going to hold the technology. Is it only going to be private companies? Well, universities have it. If they're a public institution, is that a safeguard? I don't know.
Within the context of future genetic enhancement, what do you think is some of the most critical lessons or single lesson to take from history?
You can't use this technology with the mindset that humans are different from one another. That's what eugenics, I mean, what are the primary flaws of eugenics, among others, was that the scientist went in with the preconceived belief that a person who is white and a person who is black are racially different. And if we can use this gene editing technology with the mindset of all humans are the same, and we shouldn't use it to try to make a new human, but instead to better humanity, we'll be okay. But the moment that we shift and try to build a biologically superior human, I mean, at that point, we drift back towards this question of not necessarily is this eugenics, but the mindset of it.
Looking into the future, are there any like historical parallels that you see in terms of like policy making or like public representation that probably should happen or needs to happen to prevent such a mindset or misuse of the technology?
I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind, and I don't know how a lawmaker would do this, but essentially to prevent its use on imprisoned persons. That was what eugenics was used for.
Mm-hmm.
And again, to what end? To differentiate. That just opens up a whole ethical can of worms on a variety of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But it should not be used against a person without their consent
Mm-hmm.
and full knowledge. And often, especially in the US, in cases of sterilization, there were numerous examples. People being sterilized without knowledge or consent. And that's a problem. So we have to avoid that. And I think just preserving the person's right to make a decision.
Yeah. Autonomy.
You know, but again, the U.S. still hasn't even decided on what that means. What is a person?
Yeah.
And I think that's being overly political, but that's part of what this is, right?
Mm-hmm.
An individual choice of what is a person and when does that happen. And
it's the idea of like, what does it mean to give someone full autonomy?
Exactly. Like it goes back to this question, when does life begin? And at that point, when does autonomy begin?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we, in the U.S. at least, are prepared to make have that competition. But that has to be a part of the conversation with this kind of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how do you ask a fetus? Fetus, would you like to be born with this medical condition or not? I think what we have to kind of go back to is doing the best we can with what we have in front of us.
Mm-hmm.